India's Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act on India's long-term development. I warmly welcome and kindly request our distinguished chairs, Professor D.K. Srivastava, member of the 12th Finance Commission, and Professor Tapas K. Sen, former professor of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, our esteemed speakers, Professor Ratin Roy, former director of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, and Sri R. Mohan IRS, honorary fellow of the Gulati Institute of Finance and Taxation, and our discussion initiator, Professor Lakhwinder Singh, visiting professor at the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi, to please take their chairs on the dais. I also warmly welcome our esteemed speakers, Professor Ashima Goyal, Emeritus Professor of the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research, and Professor Emma Narayana, Professor of the Fiscal Policy Institute, Bangalore, who has joined us online today. Today's plenary session concerns the impact of India's Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act on India's long-term development. The FRBM Act, with its rigid 3% fiscal deficit cap, poses challenges for long-term investments in regional development, particularly as the country aims to become a developed economy, or Viksit Bharat, by 2047. This session deliberates upon whether India should adopt a more flexible fiscal framework to balance growth-oriented public spending with fiscal discipline, especially in areas vital for development, such as infrastructure, social welfare, and human capital. Once again, I warmly welcome you all. Before we begin, I would like to briefly go over the guidelines for our session today. The first chair will introduce the session. Each chair will have 5 minutes. Speakers of the session may kindly take 8 to 10 minutes. The discussion initiator may kindly summarize the key points of discussion and may take 6 to 8 minutes, after which they may open the floor for discussion. We request you all to kindly follow the time limits to ensure a smooth session. I now invite our chair, Professor D.K. Srivastava, to formally commence the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tapas Sen, distinguished speakers, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen. In introducing the subject of Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, I think that it is useful to remember what happened in certain specific years: 2003, 2004, 2008, 2018, and 2021. 2003 is the year when the Centre's FRBM Act was enacted. It was an act which emphasized the importance of achieving revenue account balance on account of the central government. In 2004, it was the report of the 12th Finance Commission which actually constructed an elaborate and comprehensive structure of fiscal responsibility legislations, which was linked to the centre's FRBM and retained that 3% of fiscal deficit target for the center, but then added a full-fledged model in which states also had to play a key role. The model that was built by the 12th Finance Commission was a symmetric one, in the sense that the center and the states were given symmetric responsibilities. Their fiscal deficit targets were put at 3% each, adding to 6% for the general government. The debt GDP targets were put at 28% each, and the revenue account balance was considered to be important for the 2 tiers of governments. So it was a symmetric model. Then the working of the model was tested for the first time in 2008 following the global economic and financial crisis. Up to that point, it was only for 1 year in 2007-8 that the central government actually achieved the fiscal deficit target of 3%. And after that, it has succeeded in meeting the target in all the years since then. The state governments did much better actually throughout the period that we are about to review. Then in 2018, the Center's Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act was amended in major ways. Dr. Ratin Rao is here. Roy is here. He was one of the architects of that framework. And in that, in some sense, an asymmetry was introduced. Until that time, following the recommendations of the 12th Finance Commission, it was a symmetric practice that was being advocated. Now they recommended a general government debt target of 60%, but divided 40 between the center and the states, so that there was an asymmetry now in terms of the pursuit of what level of debt would be considered prudent. But they did it only partially in the sense that the fiscal deficit overall was 6%. At least the underlying fiscal deficit was 6%. And uh, it was 3% kept for the central government. Therefore, residually, it was 3% for the state governments. This, in my view, was inconsistent in the sense that if you have a 60% of debt divided 40-20, then you add a 6% of fiscal deficit, then should be divided 4-2, not 3 and 3. If the underlying nominal GDP growth is common between the center and the aggregate of the states. So there was an asymmetry which was deliberate, and but it was accompanied by a partial symmetry, which was in some sense inconsistent. But this model was also tested heavily in the presence of the COVID-19, which affected the fiscal year of 2021. That actually led the central government, as also the state governments, to depart from the fiscal deficit targets by massive margin. And the debt GDP targets also had to be uh, given up. The general government debt actually increased to close to 90%. And the center's debt was also increased to close to 60%. States government debt became about 31% or so in that year. And prior to that, it was 26% or so. The states also increased their debt GDP ratio by 5 percentage points. Now, that system has prevailed, that system was disturbed so much so that we have not been able to come anywhere close to the FRBM targets. In the meanwhile, the parameters have also changed, and growth, interest rate, fiscal deficit, primary deficit, all of these parameters, the, the conference is asking us to revisit that issue. It is worthwhile to revisit that issue and whether to consider the FRBM in terms of its design issues or in terms of its implementation issues. We have to now reconsider. Now, when we consider the design issues of FRBM, I think 2 or 3 dimensions are important. First is the issue of symmetry between center and states. We had argued very forcefully that we should have a symmetric treatment between the center and the aggregate of states, both in terms of setting a debt target and setting a fiscal deficit target. So that is a question that we have to now re-examine. The second question, which has been raised yesterday in the deliberations also considerably, is the issue of flexibility. Should we consider 3% fiscal deficit as a rigid target, or is there a desirability of introducing flexibility in these targets? Now, whether or not this is a rigid target is itself questionable in the sense that in the 2018 amendment, they had allowed a certain flexibility of half a percentage point of fiscal deficit, subject to a macro stabilizing issue coming up. Of course, we were subjected to a major shock, and none of those limits remained valid, but there was a little bit of flexibility. Similarly, in the 12th Finance Commission, when we had set 3% fiscal deficit limit, actually we had 3% of fiscal deficit related to GSDP for the states. We had introduced a flexibility also there because we had said either follow in your legislation a 3% target in terms of fiscal deficit related to GSDP or follow a corresponding interest payment revenue receipts route. If you follow an interest payment to revenue receipts route, then you can nurse a fiscal deficit which could be higher than 3%, provided your state has higher revenue receipts to GDP ratio, higher growth rate, or lower interest rate. You can nurse a higher than 3% fiscal deficit. Of course, strangely enough, none of the states which actually had a higher revenue deficit GDP ratio actually utilized that window. But I have seen lately that many of the northeastern states, which tend to have a much higher revenue GSDP ratio as compared to the average, are beginning to use that flexibility. So we have to consider the issue whether because of stabilization issue, we need flexibility or because state-wise flexibility is needed, interstate flexibility is needed in terms of setting up the targets so that individual states can be given differentiated targets vis-a-vis a common target for all states. It is another issue that we need to consider. The third issue, design issue, is what is the link between growth and FRBM Act? Now, the link that was traced by the 12th Finance Commission was that growth really depends on the available investable resources. Those investable resources come from domestic savings, and that which governments can have access to really is the surplus that arises from the household sectors. Now, that household sector savings, which was kept in financial form, actually adds to the available surplus. So that if we can add about 2% of net inflow from foreign capital, total investable resources which borrowers or deficit sectors can have access to would become 8%. And if the issue is that 6% is going to be accessed by the government, central and state governments, that not much will be left for the private corporate sector and so on. So keeping in mind the saving investment profiles, how should we link our growth target to our FRBM framework? These are the issues in terms of design that we need to consider. In terms of implementation, sometimes it is argued that we need to take lessons from international experience and so on. International experience, definitely we should look at the best practices and so on. But whether there is much to pick up from that, I don't know, because Japan, most of the advanced economies are nursing major debt levels. If you take their debt and our interest rate, then we will be landing into major disasters. So some of those issues are the ones that we need to consider. And let me now invite our speakers to kindly take up the floors. And first of all, I think we have to request Dr. Ashima Goel. She's joining online or she's joining online?
Yes, thank you. I'm here. I'm online.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
So I thank GIFT, in particular KJ, for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Srivastav. Just sharing some slides. Can you see them?
Yes.
Can you see them?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you can see them now, right? So I want to just talk a little bit about incentives putting incentives in the FRBM, because Dr. Srivastava has given us a very good overview of how it was introduced and the changes. But we have seen that the targets, as he said, the targets tend to be violated during crisis. One point to note is that there is little external discipline on the center because it only has to explain in parliament. And in a federal structure, there tends to be more discipline on states. There are some limits set by the center on on state borrowing. But this can also be diluted through PSE borrowing, warranties, etc., which we often see. So sovereigns can generally find a way to escape or to dilute rules. And therefore, I argue that some kind of either commitment or incentives are required. There is a view, as again, Dr. Srivastava told us, and this conference wants us to take, that expenditure is required for growth, social welfare, education, etc. And are deficits a legitimate way of financing higher spending? So here it is necessary to understand that, to note that India's combined fiscal deficit, current of about 7%, is among the highest in the world. And also, our governments face huge debt burdens. Center's interest payments are almost 25% of total expenditure, 3.6% of GDP. States, it's 1.7% of GDP, which is almost as large as their capex expenditure of 2.6. So debt and servicing considerations really limit possibilities of expenditure. And there is not much room to increase this further. So what I will do is quickly look at some data, because this is an institute where there is a lot of research going on fiscal issues, and these issues tend to be very emotive. And I would encourage researchers to really give us a sort of careful look at the data to illustrate some of these issues. So I'll briefly look at, we have a rich data set on states' finances now from the RBI and other sources. So we'll look briefly at some data, structures, and outcomes to see what can be done. What is, given our structure, given our data, given our experience, what is it that we can do? So first, effect of high debt on states. Here, this table, there's very little time, so I won't go into details, but I've just highlighted the best performing state currently is Odisha. And while Kerala is not the worst, but because we are in Kerala, I want to highlight that it is one of the states with the highest debt GSDP ratios. So Odisha is in green, Kerala and other high debt states are in red. So how does this high debt affect expenditure? We look at development expenditure, social services, CO is capital outlay. So we see that Kerala has one of the lowest capital outlays. Similarly, and Odisha has highest at 3.4%, while Kerala is 1.5%. So immediately, states with high debt exceeding 30% in 2024 included at least half a dozen. And for these states, interest payments tend to be, in Punjab, it was almost 22.3% of their receipts. So their expenditure ratios, therefore, tend to be lower. And high debt and low capital outlay is correlated, since capital outlay is the least committed and therefore easiest to cut. This can lead to a debt trap, hurts the state itself in the long run. Odisha used to be the worst performing state. It had the highest debt and etc. And the officials there were telling me that they just could just pay salaries and then had to shut down. This was in the 90s. But in the 2000s, a new government, Biju Patnaik was appointed. A new government took a commitment to only borrow for investment. And today it tops all state rankings. They did other things such as better accounting, expenditure management. And again, this is an area that, best practices, researchers should look into this carefully and help raise awareness among other states. So it seems that this kind of commitment, conviction, or long-term vision is a solution. The center also recently has been reducing, after the pandemic rise, has been reducing deficits and raising capex. similarly to what the Patnaik government did in Orissa. So one solution often touted is that the center should make more money available to the states. So what are the perceptions here and what are the facts? Looking at data again. First, a brief look at our federal structure and some basic principles of federal finance, principle of subsidiarity. That income taxes which are more elastic, more power has to be given to the center. Otherwise, there can be migration, which vitiates the tax base. But expenditure is best closer to the user. So here the user is at the third tier of government. Now, finance commissions decide flexible sharing based on vertical, horizontal equity, fairness. But the mandate is to achieve uniform public services through the country. But they took a detour because of our commitment to plans after independence. And so, therefore, public goods in general are neglected in our country: health, education, environment. Again, all of these are best delivered at the third tier, but decentralization is very patchy, it's almost non-existent in our society. Now, tax devolution is a right, and finance commissions appointed every 5 years have extensive discussions with the state when formulae are adjusted, state-specific requirements are kept in mind. But conditionalities can be imposed on grants, and this is one way to achieve better local public services. So some of the central schemes and conditional grants substitute for a lack of devolution to the third tier. And again, some research I have done shows that these transfers tend to be higher to the south because their better health, etc., infrastructure allows them to take this up more. But there are many inefficiencies, etc., in this. And states, of course, would prefer a free hand, no conditionalities. So is one way to improve states' spending to give them a higher share of resources? So actually, the state's spending share is higher than in most other federal countries. They spend about 64%. In other countries, this is about 40% that states spend. But only half of this is from own taxes. They spend much more than they tax. And where do they get the money from? One is transfer of resources. And there's a steady rise in shareable taxes and tax share through the years of independence. And this was raised to the highest in the 14th Finance Commission, 15th Finance Commission at 41, but because the other transfers were reduced, the actual share is settled at about 32% of tax devolution. And states really resent that there's been a rise in cesses and surcharges, which is the only element of center's tax which is left out of the sharing kitty. But this tends to finance additional transfers, because the tax devolution is actually more than half, only half of what the states get to spend. The other comes from central grants, 3.5% and 3.2% in 22-23, for example. And the 14th Finance Commission is often quoted as wanting a higher share, but what they did not expect this high aggregate of 60% to rise, but they wanted the share of untied to rise, the CSS to fall. And CSS was restructured after their suggestions. But since there was no decentralization and conditionality was still required to achieve uniform public goods. So, and moreover, this time there was very good counter-cyclical use of oil taxes. So oil prices fell in 2014 and the cess increased. And and states can actually customize CSS. Many states have done that. Bihar, for example. In Orissa, there's more local awareness. Then the second allegation is often that the state's freedom to tax is restricted, especially after GST and so on. But actually, if you compare across countries, restraints are among the least severe in the Indian federal structure. Indian subnational debt at 28% is the highest in the world. The OECD average is 20%. There is the lowest yield spread in India from center and state borrowing, because the RBI has this automatic debit mechanism, which allows high debt states to borrow at the same rate, which is an implicit subsidy. And again, the literature tells us that macroeconomic stability requires limits on state borrowing, because if each state tries to outdo the other in borrowing, then that's a recipe for hyperinflation, which happened in countries like Brazil and Argentina, which led to suitable restrictions on state borrowing. But in India, these limits are mildly enforced because we saw that half a dozen states habitually exceed the FRBM debt limits. This creates a negative externality for other states and harms overall macroeconomic stability. And moreover, some research I've done shows that taxes own tax, using a production frontier analysis, that states' own tax effort user charges are much less than potential, and that the FRBM, the conditionality put by the 12th Finance Commission, increased tax effort while transfers decreased the effort. And then the state GST, recent RBI research, their handbooks on state statistics shows that GST is actually very elastic. The Northeast states, for example, are getting a lot of much more revenue than they ever got earlier. And that this depends on how well the states collect it. And if collection is data-based, it can be very elastic. There's some figures here on the increase in the recent years. So therefore, then we come to, if commitment is not there, can we improve incentives to comply and to improve the quality of spending? And I'm arguing that conditionalities have worked in the past. For example, the conditionality given in the FRBM joining incentives by the 12th Commission really brought down the cost of state debt. And many commissions since then have had some conditional transfers, or 14 Commission had capacity building transfers. But, and then recently the conditional interest-free central loan has increased the average capital outflows of states from 2.2% of GDP to 2.6%. But there's a lot of heterogeneity across states, while UP is spending as much as 28% on capital. Punjab and Kerala, it's only 1.8%, only around 1%. The revenue expenditure capital output ratio for all states has increased from 6 to about 5.2, but this is highest at 17.1 in Punjab, and Kerala at 10.6. So high debt, states with high debt, it's constraining the expenditure quality. Also, another feature recently, which we are seeing in India, is that there is competitive populist spending taking place at the state level. Another area where conditionality has worked is in the grants the Finance Commission and Center makes to the third tier. We see that a lot to panchayats, water, sanitation, 60% to 90%, 95% of funds come from grants and from central transfers. And these conditionality in this has helped improve accounts at the panchayat level. So I'll just conclude by suggesting, investment expenditure is very, very important, not just on physical infrastructure, human infrastructure also. And we saw recently in the macro figures, as in the election year, investment expenditure slowed, growth also slowed, and is recovering as the expenditure is improving since December. So need to protect the investment expenditure throughout the country, center and states. And this also improves future taxation. And that is one reason it's so effective. There's research, again, which shows that the multiplier is much higher for investment. And I think in Kerala, the problem was they did a lot of spending on education, but they did not encourage private corporate entry or private universities. So the human capital is going out, and that reduces taxes available. Now, as Dr. Srivastava was saying, AEs have a very bad situation, nothing for us to learn from them. But if we see the US in the 1990s under Clinton had the fastest, most effective reduction in debt without harming growth. This was the Budget Enforcement Act. And they used expenditure caps rather than deficits, restrictions on deficits with escape clauses. And this was automatically counter-cyclical since deficits could rise as revenue fell in bad times. There was a pay-as-you-go rule for transfers. Government, state, and so on had to show financing for new transfer schemes. I think this is really essential in today's India's climate. Now, the center is following the Orissa model, which is that current fiscal deficit is now equal to the share of capex in GDP. So they're only borrowing for investment. This should be imposed in states also. It would reduce debt, increase their growth. It needs to be together with capacity building to take care of heterogeneity in states, mechanisms for better coordination, convergence, peer pressure states can put on each other. And then there can be the carrot of untied transfers in lieu of CSS for states, but conditional on effective decentralization and some minimum thresholds of delivery. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Goel. Wonderful to hear your observations. I think we'll take questions at the very end. Let me take this opportunity to invite Professor Ratin Roy and to make his observations.
Thank you. And I'd like to initially very quickly thank Professor Joseph, Gift, and the MSc and the Thapar School and other sponsors for organizing this very interesting conference. I've certainly learned a lot here. I've not been an academic for some time, so I haven't been to many academic conferences. So I'm going to take the topic seriously. I'm going to take the topic of Viksit Bharat as seriously as the Prime Minister. So I'm going to take that as a sort of Stalinist assertion that India will be a developed country in 2047. So if India is really going to be a developed country in 2047, I'm going to make 5 unrelated observations initially, but think about them. They're probably going to be related because these are researchable topics. What do you think the structure of the Indian economy will be? I know the government of India doesn't have the faintest idea of what it will be. They give you terms. So typically, an economy that is developed will see a reduction in the share of agriculture, will see an increase in the share of industry and services, and will move, therefore, to a more productive structure altogether, where many more people earn more money than in a third world underdeveloped country like India, whatever the size of our economy. India is a bit like Dharavi, the largest slum in Bombay. So it's very important, but it's very poor. That's not what a developed country is. A developed country is a country where people, the level of average prosperity increases. You can measure that by median income, per capita income, many things, but prosperity must increase. But when prosperity increases, there is a very definitive fiscal implication, which I want to share with you. And at the moment, we seem to be going in the opposite direction. Till this budget was introduced, you started paying income tax if you earn 3.6 times the per capita income. Today, you start paying income tax if you earn 6 times the per capita income. In every single G20 country, Indonesia being except India, you start paying income tax at 1.5 times the per capita income in Indonesia. In countries like the UK, it's 1/3 of the per capita income. In the US, it is 0.25. And in Europe, it's all under 1. Okay. So obviously, if you're going to be a developed country, you're going to have a much larger tax base, and you have 2 choices. You can choose to let that money stay in the market economy, or the government can take it from you. Typically, what happens in these cases is that the second theorem of welfare economics kicks in. And government expenditure switches into what we have already switched into compensating people for not being part of the overall prosperity business. So if you take a country like Sweden, it taxes about, it collects a lot of tax, about 35-40%. That's the size of government. And more than 2/3 of that is actually transfers. Garbage in, garbage out. And that's not a bad thing when you're prosperous. It's a terrible thing. It's a very sad thing if you're not prosperous like India. It's not a bad thing if you're prosperous. So when I was on the FRBM committee, I posed this question, and I was met with a complete blank from my colleagues. I said, surely the first thing we should come to an agreement on and get some direction from government is, what do you expect the size of the state to be? Size of the state is measured as total expenditure as a percentage of GDP, and that's approximately now 1/4 of GDP. Is this right for our juncture in development? Do you want it? What's your ideology? Do you want it to, all this accounting we can do later for unstandard deviation too. But first, basic question is, what is your ideology? Do you want a bigger state? Do you want a smaller state? And what is the trajectory you see the Indian state evolving? I think since Professor Joseph said research questions, someone here, I hope there are, interested in political economy, I think this is a fantastic research question. That take the Prime Minister seriously, never mind that he has not explicated. Okay, the Oracle has spoken, we will be a developed country in 2047. So if we take the Oracle seriously, what will be the pathway to that prosperity and what kind of size of state will be required? Number one. Number two, whatever the size of that state, you will be collecting far more taxes than you're collecting now. Not as a percentage of GDP necessarily, but obviously in absolute terms, because your GDP will be multiples. And more important, your per capita GDP will be multiples. So number of people paying personal income tax will, like any developed economy, increase, right? So you'll have some degrees of freedom there. So that is, I think, one very important question which no one asks in terms of the FRBM. We're all stuck in the present and the past. But you should be like our Prime Minister, only think in the future. So I'm doing that in this point. I'm only thinking about the very long future. Because I mean, I have no idea how to think about 2029 because no one can tell me what the growth rate is going to be, what the structure of the economy is going to be. No one. I mean, no one in the government of India or anywhere else. So we are shooting in the dark there. So let's talk about 2047. So I'm done with that 2047. Point number two. I took Ashiba's very, I think, eloquent points very seriously, but then I asked myself a question. Would I rather, if I was born in this country, be born in Kerala or Orissa? Orissa is a very fiscally nice state. But would I rather be born here or Orissa? Despite being so fiscally profligate, I think the general consensus, I'm not Keralite. I love your food, but I'm not Keralite. And it's not just for the beef. I would prefer to be born here. I think it's pretty tough being a child in Orissa, okay? However fiscally, great they are and they're putting all their money into public investment and all that. It's not their fault. It's a poorer state. It is quite logical, therefore, to take one of the following two propositions. But the proposition I would not take, and I'm going to detach from, I think, many people in the fiscal world is, I'm not going to take the position that the center is the headmaster, treating a family of states equally. That is impossible. The states are not equal. If you take that position, then your position must be, given the reality of India, that since the peninsula is rich and the Great Indian Plain, as I call the entire mass north of the Vindhyas, is not rich, the peninsula must subsidize the Great Indian Plain in perpetuity. If you expect that from the peninsula, these are important questions, then I don't think you're going to be able to impose, unless you do it through political force, and then we'll see what happens, conditionalities with any credibility. If the deal is that money from Tamil Nadu goes to UP all the time and is going to go to UP for the rest of my lifetime, but you can't say I'm going to make your money conditional, I'm going to give you grants that are conditional, and I know better than you. Because Kerala is more prosperous than Tamil Nadu. And my needs are different, and I have a right for them to be different. If Tamil Nadu has a per capita income which is close to Indonesia, and UP is poorer than Bihar, I gave a speech in Parliament after the budget, I mean outside Parliament, the Constitution Club. There were MPs there. And one MP from Tamil Nadu started complaining that in his constituency, Trichy, they didn't have a PET scan machine. When the Bihari MP started laughing, they said, we don't even have an X-ray machine. It is quite, why should somebody in Tamil Nadu be expected to be satisfied with the level of services in Bihar? Now that you have had this divergence in prosperity going on for 75 years, helped by the Finance Commission quite rightly, being an indicator where the income distance criteria is the most important criteria of horizontal devolution. That's fair, I have no quarrel with it, but consequences. So I would go easy in trying to impose any kind of uniform framework. The third point I want to make, my penultimate one, is that therefore, I think it would be unwise and imprudent in a political economy sense, however neat in a sort of policy sense, to treat the center and the states symmetrically. Because let me tell you a very simple thing I learned when I was economic advisor to the 13th Finance Commission. If you take the vertical devolution, then by definition, if you decide what the center's needs are, the states are residual. If you decide what the state's needs are, as economists should understand this, the center is residual. So why all this drama about the appropriateness of center and state? Effectively, what is residual? What really happens is there's an iterative process where the commissioners in their wisdom sort of discuss what the end result should be. And then you come up with some sort of political settlement. It's not a mathematical settlement, it's not an algebraic settlement. In which case, it follows that while it is important to understand what a symmetrical devolution would imply, one cannot be symmetrical with the center and the states. And then one has got to ask, what are the things that the center needs to finance? And what are the things that some states would like to finance themselves and other states would like to, but they don't have the money to or the market to? A very good example of that is medical education. Telangana is perfectly capable of generating private sector medical education. So is Kerala. Bihar is not. Therefore, it logically follows that, that Bihar will need far more public investment, including in human development, than Telangana is. Yes. But it then also follows that on the resource mobilization side, you cannot treat Telangana and Bihar symmetrically and provide transfers in perpetuity for the public purse to fund stuff happening in Bihar using the taxes earned in Telangana without rearranging the political settlement a little bit. Finally, I think the idea that the FRBM and the Finance Commission, for that matter, and I would echo, I think, what the Chief Minister said, should be set up as an unelected body, which I was of, and so many people here, by some joint secretary in the central government. I think that idea was fine for a long time. I think that's over now. If you just have to read the papers, and read what I wrote also yesterday, but read the papers, it's not going to work anymore that the Finance Commission's unelected recommendations are going to be taken for granted for the southern states without a bullfight. So if you don't want that bullfight to spill over into political trouble, I would say we need to renegotiate how we look at the FRBM, very differently from what the NK Singh committee did, very differently, I think, from the way it is being looked at now, and come up with a deliberately asymmetric settlement of what fiscal responsibility and budget management means to a high per capita income state, for example, to a northeastern state, and stop this pretense of all states are equal. They're not. The Northeast is subsidized, and rightly so, and will be subsidized in perpetuity. The union territory of Jammu and Kashmir will be subsidized in perpetuity. It's not going to be fiscally balanced in the long time. So we have to accept that as a union and go ahead. That also then means that given the divergences between North and South, the kind of FRBM expectations we have from Bihar and UP cannot be symmetric with what you have for Maharashtra, cannot be symmetric with what you have for Karnataka or Tamil Nadu. Questions of intrastate inequality become very important. Those will have to be factored into FRBM. So I think what you will need in research terms is, I think, a large efflorescence of culture of how to create differentiated, fit for purpose fiscal practices that states can follow. Because unfortunately today, the whole thing has become a zero-sum game. And if it's going to become a positive sum game, then there are other initiatives I would think of. For example, I'm just about to conclude. Why do I wrote this article yesterday? How do you solve the prosperity problem between North and South? There are three solutions as far as I can see it. One is just political bludgeoning. Two involve a political settlement. First is the North becomes more prosperous than the South, rapidly. And if that happens, we are home free. And then we can discuss postponing the delimitation until Bihar becomes like Kerala. But it's very important that we don't beat up on Kerala for being fiscally profligate, which is obviously a much better place to live than Bihar is. The second is that Biharis become Malayalis. They can all move here. That's what public finance would teach you. T-Boot would teach you that. There's lots of Biharis will come here, not just Governor Ravi to Tamil Nadu, some other relatively decent people will all come here and become Malayalis. And I see the Kerala government providing housing to migrants, etc. That is limited, in my view, for caste reasons. Happy to take it up later. And the third is the South becomes so prosperous, 15, 20 times as prosperous as the North, that the whole question becomes moot. That's also not going to happen because the South is bounded by the same socioeconomic limitations as the North is. So given these circumstances, we're going to have to live with this disparity for a long time. I think it's a duty of this Finance Commission and any future FRBM to clearly spell out how we are going to deal with this fiscally. So I think to conclude, the time for business as usual fiscal architecture is over. We have to take three things into account in this country. One, we are going to be a vastly more prosperous country, apparently, in 2047. And therefore, we are going to have far more taxes, and you're going to have a wider tax base. And we need to work towards having targets to attain that sort of FRBM. In a sense, a failure of that development strategy, whatever it is, I don't know what it is, would require us to have an escape clause. But that would be the ideal FRBM. Second, we have to recognize that this disparity between rich and poor states in terms of per capita income and human development is with us now for the foreseeable future. So the FRBM will have to take account of that, because the simple model of prosperous states in a minority politically, subsidizing non-prosperous states in a majority politically, that kind of good fellowship no longer exists with this kind of disparity. And we will have to take that into account in designing an FRBM. And the final point I need to make is, therefore, That FRBM of necessity now has to be designed by all the constituent units of the Indian Union, not just the union government, but also the state government. The day of unelected committees setting these things from the Delhi Sultanate, I think, is over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ratin Roy. That I'm sure would attract many reactions. Let me now invite Shri R. Mohan to make his observations.
Chair, other distinguished panelists, Professor Joseph, the extremely learned and august audience. I think we have had an academic dose or overdose on the FRBM. The topic here is that has made me stand here with a lot of preparation because revisiting FRBM for a Viksit Bharat. Let me tell you, I don't know what this large concept of Viksit Bharat is. Making India on a par with developed nations. This seems to be this thing I was going through Professor Virmani's article some days back, but is there an official policy document? I am not sure. I don't know. I have a zone of ignorance in that. So with that zone of ignorance, let me present 10 brief points before you. What is the I'm deviating a little bit from here because I'm a non-economist layman here. So what is the model of development you want when India becomes a Viksit Bharat or in your travel towards the future? Our Constituent Assembly, which framed the Constitution under extraordinary circumstances, partition, the bloodshed associated with it, did not find the need for a loose federal setup in India. So it was a quasi-federal, as KC Fear and others call it, or amphibian, as the Supreme Court of India has eminently called it in the state of Rajasthan versus Union of India. What kind of a model you are going to pursue with? The Gandhian model of decentralization did not find favor with Dr. Ambedkar or other constitution makers. Sriman Narayan's Gandhian Constitution for a Free India, that was totally different approach. Jayaprakash Narayan tried to resurrect it in 1960 with a plea for reconstruction of Indian polity, though discussed by Morris Jones and William H. Carpenter. Indian political economy students have not taken it much seriously. Be that as it may, we restarted our efforts for decentralization in 1980s and 90s, but states had scattered efforts. As political laboratories, Karnataka, Kerala, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, we had all taken efforts. But this decentralization again was seen as a ploy by the government at the union, which had lost many of its state governments. So the PMDM approach was criticized. Now, our model is PM to the direct benefit transfer. So are we in a typical top-down approach with states and other bodies going away as transaction costs in a development process? Are we to envision that? So what kind of a model are we going to envision? This is the prime question. FRBM targets, let it be there. So this is the first and foremost question. Now coming to the fiscal side, there has been a structural change in the taxation process of the union. Also the states. In the 1980s, the ratio of direct and indirect taxes was almost at 80-20. Slowly, it has changed to 50-52 to direct taxes and 48% to the indirect taxes. Indian taxation system, and after the COVID situation, it was not an one-off phenomena. Personal income tax is now the most major source of revenue for the union government. It has overtaken the corporate tax. So, going by the traditional economic literature, whether our tax DS GDP ratio is stagnant or is hovering around 12% at the union level, let us admit that the India's tax system has become more progressive in the traditional sense. Coming to the state side, more devolution, all these things have been discussed. Agricultural income was a state subject. Taxation of agricultural income was a state issue. But were the states effective in taxing that? There has been Ken Raj Committee on Agricultural Holding Tax. I mean, There were so many academic discussions. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, this used to be a major discussion. States too have miserably failed in tapping the tax in the state list. So before looking at more devolution, let us also look at the federal architecture. How have the states performed in their tax system? Here I would come to a very important point here, the third point, that is there has been a convergence of tax GDP ratio across the Indian states for quite some time. Reserve Bank of India's state finance as a study of the budget says this is because of GST. I beg to differ because it has started even before that. Is it because of the tax inefficiency of the higher per capita income states? Higher per capita income states, including Kerala, are states with a very poor public finance. This is a new paradox we are facing. Professor Kannan is there. I'm not going to deliberate much further on that. He has done an extensive work on that. So, not on the tax efficiency structure. This is not the forum for that. Here, the convergence of tax GDP ratio across states. I mean, rate convergence is one reason, but one needs to seriously look at how the high per capita income states have tapped their own revenue potential to what best can be done. I'm not saying that with the better administrative systems these states have, like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc., poorer states have been on a catch-up path with as regards the tax GSDP ratio. Now, fourth, I move to the expenditure side now. In the expenditure side, the subsidiarity principle has become really subsidiary in the political sense. To quote M.C. Setalvad, the constitutional expert, the first Attorney General, he was categorical in recommending to the first Administrative Reforms Commission that we cannot have a kind of a thing called the centrally sponsored schemes. Ramakrishna Hegde was categorical on that. The centrally sponsored schemes, 5.38 lakh crore or 5.5 lakh crore, I'm not sure, around that, the money flows to the center, so it flows to the states with minute conditions laid down at the union level, some flexibility here and there after the 2015 Niti Ayog's Committee of Chief Ministers, in which our woman Chandi was also a member. Now, the point is, what the money the states could have got as in untied funds with 100% degrees of freedom is coming as tied funds for Bihar and Kerala together, where the ground realities vastly differ. The ever-expanding concurrent list from the emergency, forest, education, everything went into the concurrent list. We are now having states and union legislating into the states list also. This is a FRBM amendment is a typical example. Now, 20% has been put as to say union will endeavor. The stronger person endeavoring means it is almost a done thing. But the public debt of the state, mind you, is a subject item in list 2 of the Constitution of India. Now somebody else is endeavoring into that. For that, Article 249 has to be invoked by 2/3 majority. Is that being done? I do not know. Now, the states which have been demanding more taxing powers from the center, how far they have empowered the local governments. Viksit Bharat's very important limb of the local governments. How far the local governments have been empowered. Local governments, I'm sorry to say, including in Kerala, are the major vehicles of implementing centrally sponsored schemes and some of the state plan priorities. Are they planning and on their own? Are the 100 flowers blooming? I do not think they are. Gram Sabhas, how often do they meet? These are the things which we need to introspect. Now, coming to varying deficit targets. 14th Finance Commission, Professor Pinaki is here, Professor DK is here, all Professor Ritin Roy sir is there. So, this 14th Finance Commission did make an attempt, 0.5% extra for states which had, what do we say, that 10% of the revenue receipts interest payments, revenue balance to zero, and one more condition, I don't remember. So, these states will have 0.5% extra. As Pinaki pointed out in a seminar, none of the states availed of it. Grants they absorb. So, varying FRBM targets, if you give it to states, I'm heartened to notice that it has been said here that some of the northeastern states are availing. If states do not avail of the limits under FRBM, are we arguing or are we shooting in the air? Now, rule-based financing is given. Rule-based financing. Britannia rules the wave. Somebody had written a paper, waves the Britannia rules, because FRBM. In UK also, these things have been waived. They were ruling the waves, now they are waving the route. So, FRBM's escape clauses have been made in such a manner that the flexibility is there for the union. States do not have that flexibility because Article 293(4) Union can impose any conditions while the states borrow. Now, be that as it may, we are a quasi-federal or an amphibian setup. Nothing much can be done about it. And more centralism is happening. I will come last to the centralism also in Viksit Bharat concept. Now, I have a question, a layman's question. As an voter of the country, I have a question. Fiscal councils have been recommended for India. FRBM, Public Expenditure Review Committees, all these things are there. Are we suggesting that the legislative wisdom which the courts celebrate in a democracy is now a subsidiary wisdom subordinate to the experts' wisdom? Do you think that many of you are economists and experts? Do you think that legislators do not know what they are passing and they need some expert guidance to go and tell them that you do not do this? Is it possible in a democracy? How do you reconcile this backslide of democracy? And one can borrow provided only if one has the Harvey Road wisdom. Harvey Road was a place where the elite street in England where Keynes was also born. Keynes' parents were staying there. Ordinary legislatures, the common man, they do not have the Harvey Road wisdom. Are we imposing the Harvey Road rule here? This is my layman's question. It may look ridiculous in an audience of experts. I am sorry for that. Now, coming to decentralization, for which I had argued, in a Viksit Bharat, when we expand, environment also takes a very crucial role. In Ashoka Modi's book, India is Broken, he has said that he has espoused the Kerala model that Athirapalli hydroelectric project had to be kept out because the local bodies and people's organizations fought. People's organizations did fight, I agree. But what happened in Silent Valley? There was a movement in Kerala, but unfortunately our assembly, with the left parties, with the exterior revolutionaries, with progressives, they said that Silent Valley is a must and environmental concerns should not come in the way. You look at the February 1978 unanimous resolution passed by the Union government. But for the environment in the concurrent list and degree of centralization, but for Mrs. Gandhi's intervention, what Kerala would have lost? I am not raising further questions. Viksit Bharat as a concept, I have a large zone of ignorance. So what kind of a model are we trying? So in that, what kind of an expenditure priorities are we going to fix? How much degrees of freedom the states should have? How much efficient the states should be in mobilizing their own revenues? These are the questions to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sri R. Mohan. The next speaker is Professor M.R. Narayan. Professor M.R. Narayana, yeah.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, you're muted. sir.
Hello, good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. Thank you very much and for the invitation to participate in this conference and also to make this short presentation on linking the flexible targeting, I mean fiscal deficit in the context of the Viksit Bharat. My approach to this short presentation is one of forward-looking fiscal policy and from the national perspective. I don't get into the subnational issues at least in this presentation. As this session is focused on Viksit Bharat, let me begin with a broad framework of this policy orientation of India now. Next slide. The budget speech of the Union Finance Minister this year has already provided us the broad vision, aspirations, and also what the Viksit Bharat encompasses. At this stage, I would like to emphasize that most of the components of Viksit Bharat are UN SDG compatible. In the context of UN SDG goals, we are aiming to meet or attain the targets by 2030. I think Viksit Bharat moves further to take up to 2047 with the clear objective of making our nation a developed nation and also marking that as the 100th year of India's independence. Next slide. In this context, I have only three points to emphasize. The points that I emphasize are mainly in the form of raising few points for debate rather than finding the complete answer to them. On the first issue of flexible fiscal deficit targeting, I would like to emphasize what can be the basis that is justifiable for such flexibility. Second, I want to emphasize on the investing in people or human capital, which is an integral component of Viksit Bharat. Can that be justifiable for long-run maximization of the demographic dividend, which actually captures the growth effects of the human capital interventions? And the final one is it possible to reprioritize public sector spending or allocation for children, especially in the early childhood, such that the targeted maximization of the demographic dividend can be attained? On the first issue of flexible targeting of fiscal deficit, I am of the opinion that we need long-run projection of budgetary resources in terms of expenditure needs and the financing option. To my limited knowledge, I have not found any reference on such long-term projections of the budgetary resources, which is essential for a forward-looking fiscal policy in the context of Viksit Bharat. Given the strong presence of the private sector in the Indian economy, a cost-sharing model of financing the Viksit Bharat looks to be more relevant, and options for non-debt capital financing, non-debt financing of the social and economic infrastructure projects are also mostly desired. For this, we need a model, a long-term model, to see how we can attain the set objectives of Viksit Bharat by 2047. Now let me take the simple example of how to contextualize such a projection model of Viksit Bharat in terms of investing on people for the objective of maximization of the demographic dividend. In formal literature on the economic demography, demographic dividend has many perspectives, but one perspective is the following. If the working age population in any country is well educated, trained, and skillful to be employable, accompanied by being healthy and gainfully employed, they generate income from production of goods and services, consume, save, and investment, and the process goes on in a dynamic context. And we are now looking for a context of investing in people in order to maximize such dividend from investing. And the resultant growth effects of the demographic dividend is very attractive for us. Now let me see how we can model the demographic dividend in the context of investing on human capital, which can also be linked to flexible deficit targeting, especially in terms of increasing the economic support ratio. A few numbers. The latest UN Population Prospects 2024 has the following projections of India's age structure transition. Kindly look at the top curve. which shows the age structure transition as it is related to adult population, working age groups being put now 25 to 60. What is important here is that in order to maximize the returns on investment of the top group of the population, we need more investment on people who are at the bottom, namely the children and the youth. Next. This is the size of the population age by age, and throughout the Viksit Bharat period up to 2047, we are going to have the highest share of the working age, and therefore demographic dividend becomes a prominent for investing in human capital. I follow a methodology of demographic dividend from the UN Manual on National Account Transfers, published in 2013, where we start with rewriting the per capita income in equation 1 as a product of labor productivity and the share of labor force to total population, which is a representation of the work participation ratio. Equation 2 is just a rewriting of the same equation in growth terms. But what is important here in the context of investing on human capital for maximization is equation 3 and 4, where we define the labor force in terms of effective number of producers, where we have the productivity scheduled by age and also population age in different years. And in the context of the effective number of producers, it is the age-specific productivity profile. And in the context of effective number of consumers, it is the age-specific consumption profile which matters. So population age structure changes is now weighted by the productivity and consumption profile, and the ratio of that is taken as this economic support ratio, different from the demographic dependency ratio. So long as the ratio increases, we have the gains in terms of higher economic growth. Once the ratio starts declining, the population aging starts, and then we need to think of alternative ways of halting the ill effects of population aging. This is the result we have calculated for the purpose of this presentation. From the year 2020 to 2015, throughout the period of Viksit Bharat target year 2047, we have an increasing economic support ratio. But in terms of the growth rate of the economic support ratio, which shows a decline because of the age structure population tilted towards more elderly, but it has not become negative because population aging will not be a problem during the period from 2021 to 2015. Now the question is, where do we invest? We have the child budget statements of the national and state governments in India, which prioritize the public allocation and spending on different components of child development, including education, health, nutrition, and other things. We are successful in documenting what the national government and state government spends on children, but not the local government. But it is a very passing reference that what government of India spends or allocates on children, for example, in 2023-24, we have the accounts data, is about 5.40% of the fiscal deficit, roughly around that crores. Thanks to the Viksit Bharat, we have the Sakshams, Anganwadi, and Poshan. And if you look at the components of this program, everything is directed or targeted for the preschool children. Early childhood care and education, early stimulations, So the entire thing is now focused on early education or early childhood education. We have Heckman's curve, which is most celebrated in the economics of education, which argues or which shows that earlier the investment, greater the returns. I think Viksit Bharat scheme like this is actually a move towards providing justification for why we want to invest more on the early childhood, because the returns are going to be the maximum. The same holds in the context of demographic dividend as well. Next paragraph. By 2047, if we accomplish the objective of the developed nation, I think these are going to be the three important, among others, implications. We have to move up in international ranking of the HDI. Now the HDI index is 0.644. To be very high, it should be 0.8080 and above. We also want to be high on international ranking on global hunger index from the present serious level of 27.3 to less than 5. And also we want to move up in the World Bank classification of the countries by level of development from the present lower middle income to a high income country. I think Viksit Bharat has a vision, has a hope. And I think if we work on our needs of the expenditure and the financing option, I think we should be more, hopeful in attaining the objective set in this policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Narayana. Let me now invite Professor Lakhvinder Singh to initiate the discussions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Professor K.J. Joseph, Professor Banumurthy, for inviting me to be part of this very important area of discussions. The topic of today's session is very difficult one, especially when we attach the adage Viksit Bharat. To me, when I look at most of the discussions which are happening around us, it seems to me that it has become a religion, new religion. So you are not expected to be critically examine this issue. Usually people believe that 2047 is the time a government has fixed a target and target is expected to be achieved. Most of the economists are doing a lot of modeling and analysis. The first kind of analysis which reached immediately, that is, it's easily achievable. And later on, after a period of lag, seems to be relatively some little bit questioning that maybe or may not be possible. So when we look into this kind of transition, usually it is a hypnotizing when we talk about Viksit Bharat, and usually people believe that this is expected to happen. To my understanding, that if we look at seriously the base level statistics, perhaps it's a very distant dream, but dream seems to be, that Prime Minister of India has recently stated very seriously that people have to achieve. It is not the government has to achieve Viksit Bharat 2047. It is the people have to achieve. So now you'll find that I can understand that you look at the kind of targets which we have fixed, especially if we invoke Keynes in the long run, we all are dead. Now, there is a contradiction between what is happening today in the policy making processes. One of the important contradiction which one has to look into is that government is elected for 5 years. The planning commission was dismantled because that was fixing targets to be achieved within 5 years period of time. Today, the targets are always exceeded than the term of the government. So this is very, and then fixing a long distant kind of targets, which perhaps the even people at helm of affairs will not be able to see the light of the day, whether they are here in this world or some other world. That's a very important aspect. The second important issue which I would like to look into is that India is a union of states. What is central government? What is the geography of the central government? I think that all the issues which we have been talking should be reversed, should be seen that states are actually functioning. And then you find that center is expected to have the dividend of the states. If states are not functioning well, the center cannot function well. So I think that the way we are moving towards centralization, perhaps that is going to be at a dangerous level, which we are expected to happen. And the divide which is being talked about, north and north and the north and south. Earlier, it is a relatively slow development in the southern states. Now it is picked up as faster rate of growth of the southern governments. But the center state tensions shifted from north to center, because if I look historically, the Punjab has been at the forefront of raising difficult questions of center state relations. But you'll find that recently it is the southern states which are coming forward. So I think that as development process proceeds, the new contradictions emerges, and I think that the intellectuals have to deal with those kind of contradictions. The issues which has been important for here to discuss is that most important aspect is that we have to deal with the kind of uneasiness which is brewing at the state levels. The reform processes which started and the rule-based fiscal policy which started later on, because the consequences of liberalization which has happened, find that to be tackled. So the restrictive kind of rule-based fiscal policy was brought in because of the adverse impact which are happening towards that. So what is the challenges? That is the policy processes which is going on is the right kind of policy. Not going to function. Therefore, the consequence is simple. The central government has fixed the targets, except the year 2007-8. They have never achieved that one. Therefore, you'll find that it is the state governments which are being restricted in terms of borrowing practices and all that. So increasingly, the rule-based policy is going to bring in more of centralization. That is very important to understand, and expected that this is going to generate some kind of tensions over a period of time. That has been now brewing up, and even the states are going to approach the Supreme Court of India. And you will find that beyond that, you will find that we don't have the kind of mechanisms. That is the mechanism where you will find that civil war is the second option, which perhaps is expected to happen if the issues which center and states are facing are not going to be addressed to that kind of problem. So now, the most important aspect which has been talked about in all these kind of discussions is that the evolutionary process of the liberalization policy which is going on and the problems which are emerging from this, it demands for a alternative kind of thinking which is expected to happen. So can we continue to have a marginal changes and going to solve the problems which we have been facing, or we have to have a dramatic change to alter the policy to reverse it, and that is very important to understand. So some of the issues the structure of the economy at a state level, it's changing. The state level changes are aggregated and we say this is the national economy. So I think that these states are not at a particular level of development. There is a huge amount of differences across states of India, as well as the structure of the states are going to be very different. Some are the states going to resemble with the Western developed countries of the world, which are few. The larger number of states are going to be traditional backward kind of states of India. So therefore, this dichotomy which has come to the fore need to be understood that the whole policy processes, including the fiscal policy structure, is expected to be talked about in this context. The another very important aspect is that the fiscal deficit is actually the monetized, is a domain of the monetary policy as well. The interconnection between what is happening when we fix the targets and if we are exceeding those targets, what is going to be the impact of the monetary policy in this context? More importantly, that how inequalities, this kind of system which has been generated over a period of time, how it is generating inequities within the states, across states of India, because you'll find that some of the developed states turn out to be relatively less developed states. Some of the less developed states have turned out to be developed states of India. So therefore, you'll find that the policy has been adversely affecting some of the states, and it is positively contributing to some of the states of India. So therefore, the standard argument and standard process of allocation of resources is very difficult to continue in this way which we have been doing it. More importantly, the resource base, which is relatively, I expect that all the corporations or the houses are operating geographically in some of these spaces. But you'll find that tax concessions only given by the central government without consulting in the state governments. So when you lose a revenue, how that revenue is expected to be compensated? Even you'll find that GST, which happened to be expected to be, if some states are suffering, could have been given the compensation, but the compensation is not being given. So I think that the flexibility in the FRBM Act, which is marginal one to the states, is perhaps is not going to work, but it is working as a weapon of the central government. So instead of flexibility, I say, is a weaponized kind of change which is happening. So I think these are the important issues need to be discussed, that we need to look into the bottom-up approach rather than the top-down approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lakwinder. The session will now be open for your observations and questions. We will take advantage of the presence of Professor K.P. Kannan here to make his observations on this session.
Thank you, Chair. I'm quite surprised. Maybe this is some handiwork of the organizer here, since I said I may not be there in the evening. Uh, I think the panel discussions uh, were quite interesting, and I think it's exposed us to a large number of issues if the country wants to be labeled itself as developed country. Although, as Mohan said, many others also said, we don't have a well-defined goal as to what you mean, what the government of India means by a developed status. And I think that is called for. And secondly, we also have to ask that what is your pathway to that goal or set of goals? To my mind, I'm not strictly restricting myself to FRBM because there are several issues and recommendations that have come, and I'm generally in favor of the critiques offered as well as some of the solutions. But I start with the question, what about inequalities? We haven't talked about that. We are reached a point of inequality. We are now vying with Brazil and some of the other Latin American countries. The Inequality Lab report based in Paris says 1% of Indians have 22% of the national income. And the remaining 99%, that is top 10%, has 57%. And the middle 40% middle 40% has about 30%, and the bottom 50% has 13% of the national income. So when I worked out the per capita income of these groups, the 1% of Indians have 52,000 US dollars, which is exactly the same as the per capita income of Germany. And the remaining 9% have close to $3,000 per capita income. Together, the top 10% has something like 13,000 US dollars. The 40% has about 1,800 or 1,900. The bottom 40% has a per capita income of around $840, which is half the per capita income of the all countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So you have the coexistence of a Germany and a large number of sub-Saharan African countries and the other maybe South Asian countries. If that is the kind of inequality with which we are now embarking on a Viksit Bharat, I don't know what is the shape of inequality curve going to be in 2047 unless you have policy instruments and other pathways to reduce this inequality. And it's quite interesting that this inequality is reflected largely, if not only, in the labor market. Now, if you take the bottom 50% where they have an income which is half the per capita income of sub-Saharan Africa, we should ask ourselves what is the wage that is required for a manual worker or similar this thing for subsistence. Now, interestingly, we had a 2017-18 committee, Satpati committee, which went into the calculation of a minimum wage based on subsistence requirements. We don't have any other calculation in recent times of a subsistence wage. And I take the results of this report mainly because they enlisted the technical expertise from the ILO, and they gladly collaborated with them and worked out in great detail food, non-food, education, health, all other requirements, and came with a number called 375 rupees per day in 2017-18 prices. If you now look at it, 2022-23, which I did, that is equal to around 446 rupees per day. And I find that close to half, around 47% of Indian workers don't get this 450 rupees per day. If that is the case, I can very well imagine it validates the inequality distribution of 50% that I said. But what is more interesting that we should be worried about, the inequality across Indian states, the regional inequality. 73% of the workers in Bihar don't get a wage of 456 or above. 73%. Unfortunately, I find West Bengal in the same category with 72%. And Kerala, I find, is 26%, which Keralites think it is high, but that is the lowest percentage. So that is the inequality we have. It's just one example. And if I remind this audience, and I'm sure many of you know, that human development, many of you have stressed, and Narayana said investment in children, which I think very much a long-term vision should include that. If you are born here, that you are like, the infant mortality rate is Kerala is 6 per 1,000 live births. It's 8 in Tamil Nadu. In UP, it is 39. So you imagine the difference, not only UP, the Bimaru states as a whole between 32 and 39. So that's the kind of, so when you reach that Viksit stage in 2047, how are you going to converge this number? And if you take maternal mortality, it is much more, I think, mind-boggling or mind-disturbing, I should say, because 19 is the maternal mortality here for 1 lakh live births, 97 in UP and Bihar. So again, you have 97 for all India, and UP has 128 or so. And so in a way that we are stuck with a problem, which is also reflected in what Jatin said in terms of the standard of living and other interstate variations that he pointed out. We are stuck with a country with manifold inequalities. It's not just economic income inequality. It is inequality in your probability of living longer. It's highly unequal. Inequality to access to food, hunger index. So we have all kind gender inequality, not to speak, you can see the women's participation rates. So when we talk about Viksit Bharat, people get carried away without knowing what exactly is this Viksit Bharat. And I think this kind of political ploy, academicians have a great responsibility to elaborate and critique that it's a very serious business. And these are the dimensions, the minimum conditions that we have to meet if at all we want to be somewhere near Viksit. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Those were wonderful observations. With such difficult questions now coming up, I think it is the right time for me to hand over to Professor Tapas Kumar Sen to handle the proceedings.
Okay. Any further questions or comments?
Thank you, sir. I am Surajit Das. I teach in JNU. I have one question to Professor Narayana online. Sir, as you were showing that our
Professor Narayana, are you listening?
Professor Narayana.
No, I'm just asking.
Yes, I'm listening to you.
Okay, great. Because there is a question being directed to you.
Yeah, please.
Sir, you were talking about those 6 goals of Viksit Bharat, which has been laid down in the Union government budget speech of this year. Those 6 goals are nothing but the UNDP SDG goals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 8, which we were supposed to achieve within 2030. And we are talking about 2047 Viksit Bharat. Are we postponing the SDG goals from 2030 to 2047? That's my question to Professor Narayana. To Professor Ashima Goel, I wanted to ask ma'am, again online, if ma'am is there.
Yes, I'm here. Please go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So if I got you correctly, probably you were arguing that higher fiscal deficit might give rise to an increase in inflation in Indian context. I mean, since we are revisiting, let us revisit all the questions then. Is crowding out inevitable because of higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio in Indian context? is inflation inevitable in Indian context, particularly demand pull inflation in Indian context because of higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio? If not, I mean, the debate is not resolved yet in the literature, but apparently in the policymaking circle, it's a resolved debate. So what is your take on this? The third question is to Professor Rothen Roy. How to make the whole country Kerala, at least through fiscal policy, at least by 2047.
Make whole country?
Thank you.
Okay, I think we should have the answers from the authors right away or later. Okay, let's have the other questions also.
Sir, good afternoon.
Yes.
Can I ask now or?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So the theme of the session, which concluded just now, is whether we want to have, as I understood, whether we want to have a flexible FRBM policy in order to achieve whatever is thought to be the Viksit Bharat or developed India aspirations or goals. During the remarks after the session, it was also suggested that Kerala, especially with regard to wages, of course, we know from the Niti Aayog index itself that the state is the one having the least poverty according to the multi-dimensional poverty index. I'm just trying to relate these two. FRBM, whether it should be flexible, in my view, is actually answered in the practice of fiscal policy by combined union and state governments, because right from 2003, when we thought 3% we will achieve, 2008, the goalpost was changed, 2012, 2016, 21, and even if 25, 26, it's not going to be achieved. So does the panel think that there needs to be immediately an approach of flexible FRBM to states like Kerala, which have achieved development indices and which are being constrained as of now because of the adherence to the 3% norm? And also this, generally in Kerala, this, the noise about Kerala being in a over-indebted position, that it's a debt trap, etc., 4,50,000 crores of debt, etc. How valid is that? So just to reframe, doesn't the panel think, or does the panel think that states which have fared well should not be constrained by a uniform imposition of the FRBM Act, when at the central level there is no adherence, there is in fact flouting of the norm? And development and state development and the FRBM.
Okay. Any more? Anybody else?
Sir.
Okay. You want to ask? Mike, please.
Okay. So, sir, can I ask?
Ranjit, okay, go ahead.
Okay. So this is actually one of the core theme the institute is initiating. So I belongs to that team. So my question to the whole panel, the first question, so as we all know that the situation where the FRBM Act was enacted in 2003, and even after 22 years, we are not in a position to, except in 1 year, we are not in a position to adhere to the targets. The basic question is, when they said that whether this target can be in line with the this fiscal sustainability frameworks, any of the fiscal sustainability framework, whether it is Dormer condition or bond model, any of the conditions, whether it is in line with the target set is in line with any fiscal sustainability framework, one, or if the states wants to achieve this target, the cost of achieving this target is discussed anywhere in the forums. Cost as in like considering the regional disparities, as Professor Rothen Roy mentioned. So that cost part, anywhere it is worked out, that is one consideration. Suppose if you are working out the cost of adhering the targets and fiscal sustainability framework, if we work out the targets first, then followed by the deficit targets, realizing the regional conditions of each state. So we have worked out one strategy for all states. I mean, select states. For example, Kerala 27.4, if it's a target, it can achieve in 5 years or 10 years based on the target fixation. And suppose if you are considering that target fixation, Viksit Bharat is the long-term agenda. We can make it in 3 years or 5 years, 10 years. What should be the ideal position? So we have done one work following Professor D.K. Srivastava and Professor K.R. Shanmugam's paper. So do we have, I mean, the panel has any take on this? The debt target should set first, then the deficit targets, considering the population position and the growth position of the states. This is my question. Okay.
Okay, I think one more question here.
Yeah. No, I'm in a sense I'm following. Now this question follows from Dr. Kannan's question. Regarding inequalities and sort of income levels and human development and various other things. Now, when the architecture of the fiscal rule is that, generally speaking, with some minor variations, it is, sort of uniform across states, which basically implies, as we go further, I mean, as it is, which basically implies that a state like Bihar or Uttar Pradesh, with a large proportion of, younger population, with the low per capita income, with the poor infrastructure, with per capita loan availability, almost 1/5 of what you get in Telangana or Karnataka. The per capita, when you fix the same percentage of GDP, just GDP. So they have a huge infrastructure deficit. They are not able to spend, and they don't really have the money to spend on education. They don't have the money to spend on healthcare. And if they have to become a Viksit Bharat and part of the Viksit Bharat, how are you going to really change the fiscal architecture? Now, here is a problem. The problem is, the whole thing is worked out implicitly in terms of, your capacity to repay, and of course, there's a certain amount of need. But here there is a need overwhelming the capacity to repay. How is it, sort of how are we not supposed to think in terms of changing the architecture towards those areas where the infrastructure deficit, physical and the social infrastructure deficit is very large?
Okay. Last question, please. Here.
I really look forward for a call for a Viksit Uttar Bharat first. Having said that, I want to be a lone wolf to raise this. That whole FRBM concept is based on the idea that savings are a stock concept. And if you take it from then the private sector will be crowded out. But it's an outdated assumption. With the banking system, a developed banking system, money is endogenous and private banking credit can expand according to the demand. And therefore, the assumption that there's a fixed stock of savings available is no longer valid. I think it is. I express my dissent, and there are a lot of people who are ready with me. I do not know how many will agree.
Okay, fine.
No questions, but little bit of information. One, there is a general feeling that in 2007, central government adhered to FRBM Act. No, it is not correct. Going by Ritin's own paper, if you add the off-budget borrowing, even that year, central government deficit was 4.3%. Point number one. Second is when you are talking about capital investment across Indian states, you should be very bit careful. In Kerala, for example, you have got 28% of the budget going to local self-governments. They invest substantially in capital formation. Secondly, when you talk about the investment by what is called KIFBI, that's not included in the budget. So we should be very careful when you compare across Indian states, particularly in Kerala. That's it. Only two pieces of information.
Now let's have the reactions from the authors. So, I mean, we'll go in the same order as the presentation. So let me ask Ashima first.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava. So the question directly addressed to me, and maybe a few remarks on other related issues. I'm a little, our thinking is fixed on fiscal deficit as the only way of expanding expenditure. So the question is about, does it necessarily lead to crowding out or inflation and so on? So what I'm trying to emphasize is that the degrees of freedom that you have available, if you have a debt and interest payments, that is eating into your resources available for better quality of spending, right? So the emphasis should shift to the quality of your spending. And here there are a lot of options available, especially since if India is on a Viksit Bharat path or going towards a higher growth path, there will be much more revenue available. And you'll be able to spend on things that improve life for everyone. It's not, and better quality does not mean infrastructure necessarily. It means human capital and all those kind of issues. So, and I just wanted to touch on this, and then, as I was suggesting, if you have adequate decentralization, if you have adequate level of public goods that empower your people to actually participate in the growth, create inclusion and equality, then there can be relaxation on the conditions because you will have higher growth and the deficit ratio will go down, right? So on the issue of inequality, I would like to say that when we have had higher growth, I don't think we should give too much weight to this WIL estimates. Price has a set of estimates on Indian inequality where they have absolutely the opposite numbers for high and low that WID has, the shares and so on, instead of 1% on top. And, so, and that is based on a survey method, while WIL relies on tax. And we know that the tax base is still very low in India. So it will lead to a lot of distortions. So what I want to emphasize is that we should not be stuck in that old fiscal deficit as the only means. We have many ways of raising resources now, increasing local tax, increasing like I think Ratan is very upset about only 12 lakhs paying tax. But the issue is that we have a lot of mobility among income slabs. So that 12 lakhs will shortly get a lot of people. If you define the middle class broadly, in the last 14 years, the number in Indian middle class has doubled. Right. So we are a mobile society and the highest growing countries in the world. We should use this access. Again, this North-South debate. I've done some research which shows the South gets more of CSS transfers because they have better infrastructure. So on a per head basis, they are getting as much from the union as the northern states do. So to play up that the South is at the expense of the North, that is not true. They gain so much from being part of a country which is growing. And I think we should emphasize those aspects and use this opportunity as Indian citizens to finally make India a developed country. Thank you.
Yeah, well, let me first, I'll come to your question. Let me first point out that there is a sort of misnomer. I mean, it's not factually incorrect. That obviously the government faces a hard budget constraint when debt levels go up. But India's debt is internal debt. So it's not like that debt is going off to the East India Company. They tried to do that in 2019 and stopped it. But it's not that the money is going abroad. So you've got to ask yourself what is happening to that money. And as far as inequality is concerned, since it's a fiscal conference, Ashima, all I have to say is, if we can't afford to charge people earning 6 times the per capita income tax, and I agree with you, they can't afford it. Somebody earning 70,000 rupees in this country, in Trivandrum, I was asking a student today who earns 70,000 rupees. I said, can you buy a flat in Trivandrum? He said, are you joking? So if that is the situation, which was not the case when I was in the middle class and starting out in my career, then I'm afraid we have to bite the bullet. This inequality is all pervasive, and mobility amongst the unequal is uninteresting for attaining this Viksit Bharat or whatever it is. Just that we have a lot of people in this country who simply do not earn enough to get a minimum developed country lifestyle. Then you have a lot of poor people, of course, but that doesn't bother me because they're not normally productive. So I'm not saying they shouldn't be bothered, but you can basically subsidize them. What is more bothering is the top half of the country is too poor to pay income tax. That is, I think, so now let me answer your question in the following way. How to make the rest of the country like Kerala? Thought experiment. If Kerala and Tamil Nadu, let me take them as one country, give me some scale. Thought experiment. If Kerala and Tamil Nadu were one country, what percentage of the per capita income of Kerala and Tamil Nadu would pay income tax? I'll tell you what it would be. It would be about 2.5. I've done this thought experiment for the Tamil Nadu government. So from a fiscal side, I would say, therefore, the only way that you can make, I mean, Kerala has a long way to go, but the only way you can attain this Viksit Bharat is if people become prosperous enough to pay more taxes. And that will only happen if we are more inclusive and inequality reduces. It's a no-brainer for me. You cannot have a high inequality country in any dimension where you can have Viksit Bharat. Someone said, United Uttar Bharat should become Viksit. I agree with you. That's simply because if you're going to remain one country, I can do these thought experiments for a future secession, for Tamil Nadu and Kerala to have their own, budget and all that. If you're going to remain one country, you are not going to become Viksit unless you narrow the gaps of inequality in every single dimension. Between North and South, between the Great Indian Plain and the Peninsula, between, poor people and rich people within Kerala, between Wayanad and Trivandrum. These are all dimensions of inequality which can only be reduced to give, only that will give you the prosperity to talk about Viksit Bharat, unless you mean Viksit Adani. I don't mean that. Final point I wanted to make is that the question of whether your taxes will go up or not go up, I think it's not an inevitability. There are plenty of countries I've worked in the world which have 3 times our per capita income, and where the government struggles to get the taxes necessary to make payments. And that happens because when you have equality, by necessity, if you don't want a revolution or anarchy, more and more of your money will go into compensating people for the failure to develop. It's happening in India. We are developing third largest, second largest, G20, Kumbh Mela, sab ho gaya. But in the end, we subsidize 800 million people. I'm sure that's not WID. It's the government of India. All right. So subsidizing 800 million people to eat, then where's the money going to come? To do health, education, and all these things. It may come privately. Geetam University might do it. The government of Telangana is not going to be able to do it, right? So for me, this entire question of FRBM is, I agree with Professor Kannan, inextricably tied to acknowledging inequality and then dealing with it. I think you should listen very carefully to what the question Professor Rao asked about infrastructure. Because if we are not able to equalize even infrastructure poverty across the peninsula, between the Great Indian Plain and the peninsula, then I'm afraid we are going to be in the situation which most students should know this. Most countries that have passed on the development journey end up in limbo. There's only 3 or 4 countries that have succeeded not ending up in limbo. If you don't want to be like Brazil, if you don't want to be like Turkey, if you don't want to be like Thailand, then this equalization is a non sequitur. It is essential.
Okay, we have already far exceeded the time limit, so I'll keep my concluding comments to the minimum. We have had a very sort of fruitful discussion, and unfortunately, I don't see any resolution. And I don't even expect really that these issues can be so easily resolved. And some of these issues have been there right from the beginning. I mean, I myself, for example, had a big fight with Vijay Kelkar with respect to FRBM target. At that time itself, I had said that I don't think fiscal deficit is the right thing to target. And the reason was very simple. I said that if you have fiscal deficit as the target, what happens is that particularly the poorer states, if they need to spend more and more on capital projects, and even if they have very financially viable capital projects, they won't be able to borrow because they're borrowing, you're going to limit. So that I think is very unfair, and particularly to the low income states. So at that time, I had suggested that either you have only one target, which is the revenue deficit, so that I can understand that you want balance in the revenue account. So either you have only the revenue account as the deficit as the target, or you can have capital sort of fiscal deficit, but then you have to reduce capital expenditure from that. the actual capital projects, you have to cut down, like you have in some of the European countries. Germany, etc., had that kind of rule that your fiscal deficit will be net of all these investments. So you can have that. But otherwise, it was going to be pretty unfair, in my opinion. That was my point of view at that time. And I think the same kind of talk has continued. Even today, we have heard same arguments. So there has been no resolution. And this is something, I think politically it becomes very difficult for the central government or the finance commission to suggest that you should have differing sort of targets for different states. Otherwise, this same point, this is actually a slightly changed version of the same point that we have had with the centrally sponsored schemes, where there is this matching ratio. I mean, we have had constant matching ratios for all most of the centrally sponsored schemes, and there also the same point has been made that all the states are not in the same position to provide the matching amount. A state like Odisha, for example, had to actually cut down on a lot of other expenditures which it wanted to do otherwise to provide the money for the centrally sponsored schemes. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case for Gujarat or Maharashtra. So this is actually a variation of the same argument. So these kinds of things, I do not think get resolved so easily. But all the same, I mean, we cannot also say that there should not be any control on the borrowing or different kinds of expenditure that the states make. There should be, I think. And without, if you sort of have subnational agencies borrowing without any kind of control, we have seen what can happen. I mean, there is the example of many of the Latin American countries like Argentina and Brazil even. You have had very high. I mean, in Argentina, you had some, at that time, every state was sort of spending, borrowing from their own central bank. The states had central banks, and they kept on borrowing from there and spending. And at the end result was something like 2,000, 3,000% inflation. So I hope that kind of thing will never happen in India. But still, the point simply is that it can't be completely unfettered. There has to be some kind of control. So we need to understand and we need to think about what or how much control should we have on the borrowing of the subnational bodies. That is sort of the key this thing. And I will just conclude with just a little bit of this thing. We have been talking slightly as I'm going slightly astray. We have been talking about tax GDP ratio and comparisons with other countries for last 2-3 days. I just wanted to point out that comparisons across the countries are not always fully valid. The reason is that uh, take for example Scandinavian countries and India. Most of the Scandinavian countries have very strong social security. So you have these big social security amounts, which is also on the tax side. So naturally, the tax ratio goes up, which is not there in India. So the comparison is not fully valid. It's a different matter that even if you take out the social security, their sort of tax ratio would still be higher than India. With countries like Brazil, there is a different kind of problem. Brazil has social security, and then there is also the sort of tradition in their budgeting that all revenues are tax revenue of the government. So therefore, we have this distinction: tax revenue and non-tax revenue. And when we talk about tax GDP ratio, we take only the tax revenue, whereas in Brazil there is no such distinction. So therefore, when they say tax GDP ratio, their tax GDP ratio is basically total government revenues divided by GDP. So that's not exactly the comparable thing as far as India and Brazil are concerned. So these are sort of before we make the comparisons, we have to think about these details. I'll stop there, and I thank all the participants, all the presenters, and all the people who made comments for a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
As we come to the end of the third plenary session of the conference, it is my honor to extend the vote of thanks on behalf of the organizing committee. I request our esteemed chair, Professor D.K. Srivastava, to present mementos to our panel as a token of our gratitude and appreciation. I first invite our distinguished chair, Professor Tapas K. Sen, to receive the first memento. Thank you, sir. I now invite our esteemed speaker, Professor Ratin Roy, to receive his memento. Thank you, sir. Next, I invite our esteemed discussion initiator, Professor Lakwinder Singh, to receive the memento. Thank you, sir. I now invite Professor K.J. Joseph, Director of GIFT, to present the memento to our eminent chair, Professor D.K. Srivastava. Thank you, sir.
We were together in the 10th finals. Long time.
We extend our heartfelt gratitude to our speakers, Professor Ashima Goyal and Professor Emma Narayana, who honored us with their presence online today. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And finally, our deepest gratitude to the audience for their participation in this session. With that, I thank you all once again and look forward to welcoming you in the upcoming sessions of the conference. Please proceed to the basement area for lunch, after which the technical sessions will commence in their